Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the question, how do learners process verbal and nonverbal information? And that is going to come up in our learning objective here, where we're defining and explaining our key theories. And today we're going to talk about dual coding. Now, dual coding is related to a lot of the ideas we talked about yesterday. Specifically, if we're talking about that information processing theory, dual coding is really looking to break down what happens between our sensory memory and our working memory, right? So what is happening as we break down things that we receive in our senses and it pops into our head? What does that look like? How does our brain handle that information? And that's kind of what dual coding is looking to answer. Now, dual coding was a concept that came out in 1971 by Alan Pavio. And it was really a theory to demonstrate that there are dual sensory channels whenever we think about different topics, okay, or we get different information. Okay, so we have this sensory system where all this information's coming in, right? We're seeing things, we're hearing things, we're feeling, we're smelling. But our brain then, according to dual coding theory, is breaking down that information into two types of information. Okay, so as we sense things, as information comes in, it's either categorized as verbal information and it enters kind of that verbal system, or it's categorized as nonverbal, okay, and it enters that nonverbal system of processing. We're going to talk about both of these. Okay, first up is the verbal system. In the verbal system in dual coding is how we process things tied to language. Okay, so when we talk about verbal representations, keep in mind that we're talking about kind of the language representation of something. So as you hear things and you start to think about them, you might think about them either in terms of a language or in terms of pictures and smells and that sort of thing. So the verbal representations that pop into our head, the ones tied to language, are going to be in that verbal system. This is things like text. Okay, if we're reading words, okay, that represents a language, right? Speech, math equations, foreign languages, or even Braille or sign language. Okay, any of these, if you see and interact with them and you're thinking about them in terms of the language you know, right? And what those words are and what they represent. Okay, so that is kind of the verbal system on the verbal side of our dual coding. On the flip side of that is the nonverbal system, right? The information not tied to language. So nonverbal representations are things like images, sounds that aren't words, feelings, smells, or even animations in video that you might imagine in your head. Maybe you're imagining someone walking down the street. Well, if you can see them walking in your mind, that's a nonverbal representation. Okay, or if you can maybe remember the smell of maybe your significant other, right? That's a nonverbal representation. That's a thought that pops up into your head, but isn't exactly tied to words or language. Okay, so Pavio thinks that we process these differently and that we have kind of different systems for organizing each. Now, when the brain goes and it takes these verbal or nonverbal information and it goes to build connections to encode that information so we can remember something, Pavio calls this the associative structure. Okay, and this is when we associate things within the same category. So associative structure is something like verbal to verbal connections. Okay, in-house, we're talking verbal connected with verbal ideas. And this might be something like, if you hear the word apple, maybe your brain thinks of the word seeds. Okay, apples have seeds. I remember that. I'm thinking in terms of our language. I'm thinking about the actual words, apple and seeds here. Okay, maybe when you hear apples, you think of colors, red or green. What kind of apples are we talking about? Maybe you think of trees, right? Apples fall from trees. Or maybe that idea, apple falling from a tree, makes you think of Isaac Newton and then gravity, right? But this is an example of an associative structure for the verbal system when we're talking apples. Okay, so you can kind of see how that schema is formed. And with the associative structure, we're comparing verbal to verbal or nonverbal to nonverbal. So on one hand, you might be thinking out loud in your brain. You might be thinking of, in terms of the language, maybe this is in English, maybe it's in Spanish, if you're a Spanish native, or if you teach in Spanish. Okay, maybe you're thinking about all these terms in a different language. That would still be verbal to verbal. But if we're talking nonverbal to nonverbal, maybe you're picturing these ideas in your head. Maybe you see a picture of an apple, and you're thinking about what that apple looks like, and you're thinking about what the seeds might look like of the apple, right? You're imagining what color that apple is. You're imagining the tree it might have fallen from, right? You're getting these images in your head. This is the nonverbal system, right? And this is kind of our structure, that associative structure of nonverbal. We're thinking about different pictures. Okay, maybe when you picture that tree, you picture an apple falling on Isaac Newton. And then you start daydreaming about what gravity might look like. Okay, so this is associative structure. This is kind of within category. So verbal to verbal, nonverbal to nonverbal. And then the last part of Pavio's theory is that we not only build connections within kind of these categories, but we also build referential connections, okay, where one idea connects to another, right? Where verbal information connects with nonverbal. Okay, if you're thinking about the word apple, maybe a picture of an apple pops into your head, or maybe you see the picture in a lesson and you think of the word apple, right? But there is a connection because the word refers to this picture, this image in your mind. And you can imagine that would work on kind of this entire schema here, right? Our colors, the color red generates the image of red in your mind, right? The concept of seeds generates an image of seeds, and so on. Okay, so these are called referential connections in dual coding. And this is because the word refers to an image, or the image might refer to the word in your mind. And there's strength there as well, because you can imagine if we accomplish encoding, right, learning by building connections between ideas, what's cool about dual coding is now we have the word of an idea as well as a nonverbal representation of that idea, right? So we get two types of representation. So we're going to have at least twice as many arrows, if not more, because of these referential connections. So we just have tons of connections that we can build according to this theory. And here we can see how Pavio proposed the dual coding theory. This is figure 1 in the article we're going to check out today. But this is kind of how we drew it up, where we're getting this verbal or nonverbal stimulus. Okay, our sensory system is processing it. And then we figure out how are we going to represent that in our mind. Pavio uses some kind of interesting vocabulary. He thinks of the verbal representations as logogens and the nonverbal representations as imagens. Okay, we're not going to use that a ton in this class, but it might come up in the paper today that we're going to take a look at. And we talked about those referential connections between and how we kind of associate these ideas within each other within. So that's kind of the theory in a nutshell. I think the important part to recognize is that we can think about an idea in different ways, and we can then connect those different ways together. That's really important. In next class, we're really going to dive in to how those referential connections are made and kind of some best practices we can use to maximize this connection here and to minimize that cognitive load. So we're really building towards that next class. As far as today, remaining tasks, things I want you to check out. I do have a reading for you that is from Pavio himself, where he introduces dual coding theory and talks about kind of its frame in education. It is a longer article. You can read the whole thing if you'd like, but he really introduces that dual coding theory in the first 8 or so pages. So I'd like you to at least read pages 149 to 157. And if you want to keep reading after that, you can, but we're going to look at another theory on how to apply a lot of these concepts. So we're not going to stick with this entirely. We're going to use dual coding theory as a jumping off point as we start to look at Meyer's work next week. We also have some options to extend your learning. Okay, there's a dual coding theory video. That's about, I think, 12 or 13 minutes if you want to check that out, maybe learn some more about dual coding theory. There's also a short article if you want just a quick refresher from instructionaldesign.org that you can check out. Also, we have our quiz and our discussion 3. Okay, so that's what you have left to work on today. Now we can pop over to Web Campus and see what that looks like. All right, so here's what today's module is going to look like, as well as the video once it gets posted. Per usual, there is the PowerPoint if you want to copy these slides to check them out. There is our article that we're going to read there. Remember just those first 8 pages there. A couple options to extend your learning if you're still confused on this dual coding idea. There's a practice quiz and our discussion 3. Okay, so that's what you're going to work on the rest of today. If we take a look at discussion 3 here, we're still going with this 4-question format for now. We will change that up kind of in the future, but we'll probably stick with it this first week or so. And just a couple questions for you. One, I want to know if you've experienced the good use of dual coding in an instructional context, where they're using that verbal representation and nonverbal representation. So if you have an experience of someone doing a good job with that, it can be as a student, a teacher, administrator, trainer, trainee, kind of whatever your role was, just tell us about that experience and what made it work well. Okay, number 2 is the flip side of that, where we're looking at a poor use of dual coding. And maybe there wasn't representations that were verbal and nonverbal. So let's describe that. What made that not work? Okay, maybe what would you have liked to see better to help you understand in that instructional experience? And then question 3, we have the classic phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I want you to think about this from the idea of dual coding. Does that statement hold true or not hold true? Right, and then kind of try to explain your reasoning there. And finally, number 4, I would like to know, why do you think dual coding is important when we're designing our visual media, right? So we're, once again, this course is about designing visual media, so we're tying everything back. When we're making pictures, presentations, videos, why is this idea important, right? That's the big goal of today. That's what we want to learn. Okay, so go through those resources, try out that quiz, answer this discussion. Remember, I'd like you to make your first post by Friday and then reply to your 2 classmates by Monday. Once again, shoot me a message on Canvas or through email if you have any questions, and you guys have a wonderful day.